Good afternoon from a very sunny Inverness, but aware it might be a good morning or a good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name's Jaya Calder from Highlands and Isles Enterprise, and I'll be running this afternoon's webinar. Before I pass on to my colleague Gillian Morrison to do the introductions and say a little bit about our speakers, I'd like to quickly cover some housekeeping. We're recording the webinar this afternoon, and we will be sharing a copy of the link to everyone on the webinar, as well as the many folk who weren't able to join us live. We'd love your interaction, so please use your question box at any point throughout the webinar to share your questions, comments, or observations. Now, we'll try and cover as many as we can in the time available for the Q&A, but for those that we can't cover in terms of questions, we'll get all of those answered after the webinar and get back to you. So I'd like to pass over to Gillian. Gillian.
Hi, thank you for that, Jaya. Good afternoon, and I'd like to add my welcome to all our attendees and presenters this afternoon. We're delighted to be hosting this webinar on behalf of the Scottish offshore wind clusters, Deep Wind and Forth and Tay Offshore. My name is Gillian Morrison, and I'm with the Energy and Low Carbon team at Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and I'll be helping facilitate this session today. The webinar is focused on ScotWind and the recently announced leasing, and a particular focus around the supply chain development statement, which I'm sure you're all looking forward to hearing from. We're also going to have some short presentations from a couple of other presenters. Brian McFarlane from the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council. I'm going to do a very short slot on engagement and communication. And we also have Simon Wallace from Scottish Development International. And we'll hear from all of those before Colin McKeever of Crown Estate Scotland. We're going to move straight to our first presenter today, and so I would like to introduce Brian McFarlane, who is the co-chair of the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council. Brian.
Thank you, Gillian. Hopefully everyone can hear and see me.
We're fine, Brian, thank you.
Great. So I'll kick off then. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to provide a bit of a kind of update and status of the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, which I co-chair. And obviously, I think this is really welcome to have this webinar today as well. I think it's important in relation to particularly those involved in the offshore wind sector or who could be involved to have visibility of what's going to be happening in Scotland, whether that be in the short, medium or longer term. But what I am confident about is that the sector does have longevity. Offshore wind is going to be essential to deliver both the Scottish and UK government climate change and net zero targets. And I also think it's fair to say that the need for offshore wind and the longevity for the sector was apparent prior to the current pandemic and is most likely going to be essential as we recover from it. It is positive as well that there's been so much attention being provided to seeking a green recovery. And as some of you will be aware, I attended a successful cluster event in Glasgow in January where I provided an overview of SOWEC. And this is effectively what I'm going to give as well in the first couple of slides, particularly for those who haven't heard it before as well. And it's basically just to get an understanding of what we're trying to achieve. So I'll touch on those slides just now. So the purpose of SOWEC, I should say that it's abbreviated to SOWEC, Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, is to support the offshore wind industry in Scotland following the UK offshore wind industry securing the sector deal with the UK government. And it's by providing leadership to the industry in Scotland to maximise economic benefit and the growth potential. This is to be achieved by mobilising action to address the sector deal commitments and how they relate to Scotland, and in particular its differing policy landscape. So the council comprises representatives of developers, supply chain, ORE Catapult, enterprise agencies, skills agencies, Crown Estate Scotland, and Scottish Renewables. And we have agreed a vision, which is an offshore wind sector which plays to Scotland's strengths, delivering jobs, investment and export opportunities in line with the UK sector deal as part of the path to net zero. We have established 5 goals, which I'll briefly summarise, that is deliver at least 8 gigawatts of offshore wind in Scottish waters by 2030. This was and is based on the 30 gigawatt, the sector deal's 30 gigawatt target. If this change, which would encourage it does change to 40 gigawatts, then we'll obviously reconsider the SOWEC target. We want to create a competitive and commercially attractive offshore wind sector in Scotland. And we want to make sure we're developing a sustainable world-class supply chain as well, as also increasing the number of jobs to more than 6,000, and now we're reflecting that again should the gigawatt target change as well in the future. And very importantly as well, we would also develop a plan for offshore wind's contribution to achieving net zero in Scotland by 2045. So all these goals, as far as I'm concerned, are still absolutely relevant from when they were established last year. And what is absolutely paramount to me is the ability for the offshore wind sector to provide opportunities to organisations who are attending this webinar. Working groups, and we've been formed to allow interaction with the sector deal and seek to prioritise the delivery of the SOWIC vision and goals. And these are the developers group, and us as with taking consideration from a Scottish perspective, the approach to the CFD and the future of the CFD mechanism, the grid charging in GB and how that relates to Scotland. There's a supply chain and clusters group with focus on the supply chain and the 2 Scottish clusters. There's an innovation group which is considering the technology and fabrication issues we face and specifically what Scotland's USP should or could be. The innovation group are also engaged through the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult with the Oil and Gas Technology Centre and looking at how we will move from the current energy transition. We have established a barriers to deployment group which is tackling environmental consent and licensing, aviation and grid barriers that we will face in Scotland and currently face and look to overcome. And the skills group as well, which considers what the sector and supply chain needs are, and also the skills group are also working for the 2 Scottish clusters. So I would also like to highlight some of the key objectives which SOWIC and the groups are currently focused on. These were prepared pre-pandemic, however there was discussion at the latest SOWIC meeting, appropriately so, to consider the impact of COVID-19 and how we can mitigate that impact. Also how to position ourselves to maximise the ability to recover economically through the development and deployment of offshore wind. Hence the launch of ScotWind and the update from Colin today is also very timely. So some objectives we want to achieve in SOWIC over the short to medium term are to work with the wider renewables industry in Scotland to develop and put forward the case for reform of the transmission charging regime. That will support progress towards meeting the net zero targets. Also, very importantly, reduce or level up the differential in charging between the north and south of Great Britain. And this will hopefully, I'd like to think so, make the Scottish projects more competitive in future CFD auctions. We're also ensuring that there's coordinated action is being taken to address the environmental constraints that will enable SOWIC targets to be met for the deployment of offshore wind in Scottish waters. And also we want to ensure that we understand the skills demand to meet the goals and determine how they will be supplied. Very important for this webinar is how the Scottish supply chain will develop over time, and we will look to set what we think is a vision to the 2030 and the 2050 targets, 2050 specifically, because we want to consider offshore wind in the Scottish, UK and global context. Also need to consider there what the different varying phases of the projects are, for example, the development, construction, operational phases. We aim to provide strategic leadership and guidance to the Scottish offshore wind clusters. And this is in the knowledge that SOWIC can support the clusters through the links to the sector deal and the Scottish and UK governments. And we also want to use innovation to create the building blocks for a successful floating wind sector in Scotland. I think this is going to be ever more important over time. And with that, build a successful supply chain. And considering with the in-depth knowledge we already have within the subsea sector within Scotland, we want to transfer the skills, experience, knowledge and assets from the oil and gas sector. And just note my previous comments in the engagement between the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult and the Oil and Gas Technology Centre. So I look forward to hearing other presentations and in particular the update from Colin and ScotWind, which for me is another huge step to realise the potential to develop offshore wind at scale with associated economic and climate change benefits to Scotland. So thank you very much, Gillian.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. I'm now going to take just a couple of minutes to focus on the next agenda item, which is around developer engagement strategy, and it's primarily looking at engagement and communication across public sector and industry, and importantly, our supply chain and our communities. Across public sector partners, which you can see on the screen just now, we are very aware of the level of engagement, an increasing level of engagement, which ScotWind and the supply chain development statement process is going to necessitate as we all move through this next chapter in the development and deployment of offshore wind in Scotland and further afield. Acknowledging that, public sector partners have sought to establish an engagement strategy with two primary objectives. The first is that we ensure that our supply chain and communities are informed and best placed to respond positively to the ScotWind opportunities. The other side of that is also acknowledging that we need to manage expectations both across industry and the supply chain to ensure everybody is sighted on both the stage and information required at each stage of the process. In recognition of this, and with the objective of both ensuring developers are aided and directed proactively and efficiently to our supply chain and communities to capture all the information necessary to achieve ambition for maximum economic impact as the bids are developed, we are also seeking to ensure expectations are managed throughout our communities and businesses across Scotland, recognising the transformational opportunities ScotWind can deliver, but also recognising we are in a competitive environment, certainly at this stage. And we acknowledge there is a balance to be struck. We see this as being both achievable and positive through constructive and regular communication by both industry and public sector alike. We're seeking to work with industry, the supply chain and communities to ensure that our supply chain is engaged at this early stage so that any growth or investment required to deliver the scale and pace of ScotWind is acknowledged at this stage, and that the supply chain are ready to deliver a competitive, sustainable contracts for ScotWind. We want to ensure, as I said previously, that we are best placed to respond to very specific and direct approaches, and acknowledging that the supply chain development statement is going to necessitate that additional level of detail and information at a much earlier stage. We want to acknowledge the variety of touch points that are across Scotland, both at a Scottish level, a regional level and an area level. We are also aware that some of our supply chain companies and businesses and our communities may have experience in this area before, and however it may be new to some others, and we want to, from a public sector perspective, encourage developers to speak to public sector partners in the first instance if you don't already have these touch points and contacts. We want to ensure that we can direct you to the most relevant place in terms of contact points. The other points there on the slide is what I've already mentioned about expectation management, and all linked into the supply chain development statement. So in summary, this was just a couple of minutes to really highlight that we acknowledge there will be an increased level of engagement required across Scotland in order for the supply chain development statement information to be gathered in as much detail as possible, and also recognising the stage of the process that we're at. Really encouraged to see the development statement coming through as part of ScotWind, and we look forward as enterprise agencies, Scottish Government, Scottish Development International, and indeed the clusters to be your contact points for any inquiries that you have. I'm now going to hand over to Simon Wallace of Scottish Development International. Simon.
Hi everybody, thanks very much for joining us today in the webinar. I'm just going to give an overview today about SDI, who we are, why you would want to speak to us, and how you get in touch. So a little bit about who we are. We are the international specialist trade and investment arm for Scottish Government, for Scottish Enterprise, for Highlands and Islands Enterprise, but also for South of Scotland Enterprise as well. So we look at those areas where we can help these companies internationalise. Single point of contact for everybody, whether you want to do inward or trade. And we obviously work in very close partnership with our local authorities, our business gateways, our Skills Development Scotland. And basically, as Gillian said, all the public sector partners, we try to work in a very joined up manner to try to deliver what we can for you. Okay, just a little bit about our purpose. Our purpose is twofold. Ultimately, so it's international trade, so we're trying to help companies from Scotland trade internationally using our 50 years worth of offshore engineering experience to try and export that to the world, specifically in offshore wind. And on inward investment, we're trying to get the companies who are involved in this area back into Scotland to try and do it from here as well. So we raise the ambition of Scottish companies to work globally. We are trying to attract investment, talent and innovation to Scotland, and trying to increase the competitiveness of the companies and trying to enhance the Scotland's image globally. We work across a number of sectors: technology and advanced engineering. These are areas where Scotland has a specific strength, where they think they can do an X more than they can in other areas. So there's food and drink, life sciences and chemicals, financials and business services, tourism, and of course, the most important one, energy and renewables. So what can we do to help you? If you're a Scottish company looking to trade overseas, we can help you to identify market opportunities, provide market intelligence, help you to develop your strategy development for the company, prepare your businesses to trade internationally. What does that mean for companies who are making their first steps into international trading? And help you identify business partners and support options for your finance as well. And help you facilitate those connections with business relationships, both through our people who work overseas and potentially with Global Scots, our globally networked connection of people with an affinity for Scotland. On the inward investment side, that's where I am. So we look at collaboration and risk reduction, helping companies who are already here further expand, and obviously help new companies set up. One of the most important things is trying to identify the right staff for your company. So it's helping identify the staff, looking at the training, provide for those new staff, the property, and links with academia as well as other companies. Identify business partners and potentially financial assistance for the right companies setting up the right areas. And once you're here, we don't just ignore you. We have a dedicated aftercare team who will look after you once you're here as well, and hopefully help you to grow in Scotland. A couple of case studies, one of Pickerington, which is a trade, one of improvised, but given time, I'll probably skip on to the next slide, which shows some examples of companies we've managed to pull in on inward investment over the last few years. Obviously a large number of companies there, but we have been rather successful. In the recently published Ernst & Young Attractiveness Survey in 2020, Scotland has managed again for the 7th year in a row, maintained its reputation. We have the second highest inward investment scores for any area in the UK outside London. So we are again very proud to do that. And you can see some comments are there from other parties as well. And obviously we have an international presence, 35 international offices you can see there across 23 countries, 16 languages, and over 120 staff based overseas. So ideally, if you're somebody looking to come to Scotland, we have a local contact where we can help you do it as well. Now, in the offshore wind area, one of the areas we've very much tried to help companies engage with developers as they make their first steps into the country, trying to introduce them to other companies where they can, both in their supply chain and potentially to sell to as well, and try to bring you into the country and help you as much as we possibly can. Okay, that's me. Thank you. And that's where you'll find me.
Thanks very much, Simon. Thank you for that. Just to say, I mentioned it at the beginning, all the slides will be available after the webinar. Going to move on now to Colin McKeever from Crown Estate Scotland. You'll all be very interested to see and hear what Colin has got to say, so I will pass over to Colin now. Thank you, Colin.
Hi everyone. I'm not sure I'm going to live up to that build up, but we'll see what happens. So as Gillian said, I'm Colin McKeever. I work in the offshore wind team in Crown Estate Scotland, and we've recently launched ScotWind leasing and an engagement document on the supply chain development statement. So I'm just going to give a sort of overview of the leasing and what we call the SCDS in order to sort of give you a good understanding without going into too much detail. So hopefully we've got that balance right today. So first of all, to sort of explain what we're doing, the reason that we're doing offshore wind leasing is to offer successful applicants the chance to build new offshore wind farms in Scotland. They'll be built and delivered around 2030. And from a Crown Estate Scotland perspective, we're looking to utilise the potential of Scotland's significant marine resource in accordance with two overarching documents. One is the new Crown Estate Scotland Act, which I won't go into any more detail on just now, and the National Marine Plan. So the way that we're doing that is by implementing ScotWind leasing, as we've called it. The target outcomes are broadly to help Scotland deliver its net zero ambition as part of the overall UK effort and the aspiration for the offshore wind market to play a big part in that, and to deliver large scale capital projects which will help power the energy transition for Scotland's economy. The specific objectives of the leasing is to provide certainty and clarity of how to develop a project, how to get seabed exclusivity, which we feel will attract a number of different parties into the already maturing Scottish market. We are going to be transparent and open and fair, and that's a sort of key principle of everything we've done so far and of the launch documents. Meanwhile, we want to stimulate the competition and innovation needed to move the industry on to facilitate cost reduction and really to build on the 2 target outcomes above. So we've spent the last 2 years engaging with all parties on our process as we've developed it since the discussion document in May 2018, I think, and we're looking forward to continuing that as the process develops. So Scotland is quite particular and in some ways quite peculiar in that the seabed is managed by Crown Estate Scotland, and the remainder of the primary consents and permits are provided by Marine Scotland as the kind of regulator and being responsible for strategic marine planning within the government. That comes into the agreements where we have a limit. So there's a link between ourselves and Marine Scotland as the projects progress. So we'll eventually look to grant a lease for the seabed, and we're only capable of doing that once the permissions and consents are in place. And those permissions and consents for specific project proposals will be issued by Marine Scotland. So that's looking forward in time to everything going well. And currently, Marine Scotland are undertaking a process to finalise and adopt a sectoral marine plan, which comes from the national marine plan that I mentioned earlier. So this process will identify the preferred areas for commercial scale offshore wind in Scotland, and the areas that are included in the adopted sectoral marine plan will be available for applications in ScotWind leasing. The consultation draft or the draft plan was consulted on until I think the end of March 2020, and Marine Scotland are now going through a process of finalising that. So the launch documents that we issued earlier this month are all based on the information in the draft plan, and they're going to be reviewed once the plan is adopted. In autumn 2020, we're going to review the final leasing requirements to make sure that we properly align with the details of the adopted marine plan. So that's an important area which sort of everything that we've presented in the launch documents so far reflect the draft, but they are subject to potential change to make sure that the adopted plan is properly catered for. So applications to us will be for an option agreement, which will last up to 10 years. And if they're successful in meeting the requirements of the option, then successful applicants will step into a lease for up to 60 years of wind farm operation. They'll pay a fee to Crown Estate Scotland for the option, and that will be determined by applicant valuation on a per square kilometre basis. So it's relative to the amount of seabed that they've secured. The project scale and configuration will also be defined by applicants within certain limits. So as I said earlier, they need to be within one of the plan option areas in the adopted marine plan, and they need to have a continuous boundary that falls wholly within one of those. So going between two or having disconnected projects isn't considered acceptable to us. The minimum capacity for commercial scale offshore wind projects in the sectoral marine plan is 100 megawatts. So we won't be capable of providing option agreements or leases for projects under that threshold. The amount of seabed that they can secure under option goes up to 860 kilometres squared. Or I suppose if there's an option area smaller than that, then it would be limited by the option area. And we're looking at a minimum area of around 20 kilometres squared. That figure is really about density and making sure that the density requirements are met while still adhering to the minimum capacity requirements. So the submissions are going to be through a ScotWind leasing portal, which has gone live for potential applicants, where they've been able to access the application form, guidance notes, a detailed offer document, and other launch documents. And it's going to be a discussion between us and potential applicants is going to be focused around this new portal, which seems to be working very well so far, which is great. The applicants must be able to determine a suitable level of financial resource and experience and capability. And that's really bound in us looking for the best possible developers for the best possible projects. We're going to ask them for information in order for us to assess their project concept and their delivery plan for that concept to make sure that they understand the environment that they're in and that they have the capability and experience of delivering the project that they're looking for, an option agreement to deliver. We want to understand their proposed development budget, and we want to make sure that they've got the financial resources and commitment to really make that happen. The level of information, we're expecting a significant understanding of the areas that they're looking for project for and the offshore wind market, but we realise that detailed investigations may not yet be available, but certainly an understanding of what they're getting into and an explanation to us which illustrates that is going to be necessary. So option agreements, after the evaluation, we're going to rank applications, and option agreements will be awarded to the highest ranking applications, making sure that the total award is still within the limits set by the sectoral marine plan, which will confirm that, well, the adopted plan will confirm the total area of seabed that's possible in this cycle of ScotWind leasing within any plan option area. And in total, so counting up all of the agreements, we aren't going to exceed 8,600 kilometres squared of seabed. And that's the way that we're going to measure projects to make sure that we comply with the capacity elements of the sectoral marine plan. Now, the overall ranking, so to create that sort of hierarchy, we're going to look at course grading first, where any band 1 score means that the applicants aren't considered adequate or capable of progressing in the project, but band 2 and 3 are both good for us. The applicant valuation will be the next ranking criteria, and that's where they can choose a £1 per kilometre square basis for that option fee that I mentioned earlier. We'll then do a detailed numerical score between 0 and 450, which will help distinguish particular element on the points that I touched on earlier. And finally, in the case of a tie break, there'll be a randomly allocated number at the time of registration, and that will be the process to determine who's higher in the ranking. Hopefully it won't come to that. If there's competing interest, so if there's an overlap of proposed project area or they're within 5 kilometres of another project, we consider that to be in competition. And where there's competing interest, we aren't going to ask people to change their proposals. We aren't looking to sort of come up with compromises. We're going to award the option agreement to the highest ranking party, and the other applicants will not be able to progress that particular application. In the event that there's still space left within the sectoral marine plan limits that I mentioned earlier, it's possible that applicants who are defeated on competing interest could access a clearing process which would allow them to select an area of seabed that isn't in competition with any higher ranking parties or any other parties, which they can progress in due course. The timelines: ScotWind launched the 10th of June, a done emoji, which our comms people will hate. There's an engagement event for potential applicants, which will go into some detail with them on particular elements of the questions and the guidance on the 7th of July, which is remarkably soon. The registration window for potential applicants closes on the 5th of August, so any potential applicants, we want them to register with us through the portal. And if you don't register your intention for each potential application, then you won't be able to submit an application later. But just to be clear, that doesn't mean if you do register, then you're bound to applying. The next point on the timelines is where it becomes slightly more uncertain. So we're going to publish a post-adoption addendum, which is after the sectoral marine plan is adopted by ministers, which will confirm the closing date for the bidding window. It will confirm the final arrangements for the supply chain development statement, and it will confirm any changes to the leasing documents as a result of the adopted plan. The application window will then open at a date after the post-adoption addendum, and then we hope that the deadline for applications, we've given target date or indication of dates here from October to early 21. Those dates really do depend on when the sectoral marine plan's adopted, which is something that we understand Marine Scotland are progressing, but we aren't able to be clearer on at this time. So we hope including those dates is a sort of helpful indication rather than anything definitive or a target from us. So the part of the ScotWind leasing application package requires developers or applicants to make a statement of commitment, which gives a very senior level commitment to the application and makes clear that they stand behind everything that's been put forward as evidence in the submission to us. They range across a whole lot of different specifics, but they include elements on the supply chain. So there's specific commitments on option holders to make sure that they advertise all procurement activities related to the project, including to SMEs. We want them to establish and actively engage either alone or with other developers with a supply chain forum. So that can be a new thing or an evolution of something that already exists. We expect them and require them to meet regularly with all of the economic development agencies that were listed earlier by Simon, I think, on this slides, and also to provide Crown Estate Scotland with all of the supply chain plan information, which is part of the CFD process. So that will help connect the work that we're doing with the leasing and the access to market that's being led by BASE. These specific behavioural sort of obligations are supplemented by the presence of the supply chain development statement, which is a new element of the leasing. I've just clicked to the next slide. So complete supply chain development statement submissions won't be used in the assessment or detailed scoring of applications, but they will be made available to government and agencies and available to the public. I think it's a bit of a balance here, and we feel that the best selection of the best developers and the best project isn't the one who's going to promise the most on day one, it's the one who's most capable of delivering. So the supply chain development statement will be incorporated into the option agreements and will become part of that legal document. And there's obligations initially and then obligations that will be ongoing throughout the option period, as I said, up to 10 years until they look to call the lease. Now, at the time when they do look to call the lease, there'll be a requirement for option holders to provide a contracted position statement, which will be submitted to us as part of what we call the option notice. And that contracted position statement will be measured against the most recent supply chain development statement. And where those commitments aren't met or aren't demonstrated by the contracted position statement, there'll be a contractual remedy able to be applied by Crown Estate Scotland, depending on the level of achievement of those commitments. So the SCDS is made up of a few different points. The first is the SCDS commitments. So there's a 4x4 table, which gives a clear and simple measure of jobs broken down by location. Now, they can be created jobs or retained jobs, and we're using that as a helpful indicator for supply chain growth as a result of the project. Now, these commitments must be present as part of their application, like I said earlier, and they must be updated every 2 years throughout the option period to reflect progress during project development of the commitments that I mentioned earlier around the need to engage with enterprise agencies, the need for a supply chain forum, the need for advertising all procurement activities and the rest. So we're really looking for that update to reflect the progress and successes of the implementation of those obligations. So the commitments will be played by a narrative, which will provide evidence and justification for why the commitments are achievable, and any additional requirements or dependencies which are being relied upon for those figures. The narrative is going to be used as a basis for Crown Estate Scotland approval of the commitment updates every 2 years. So we really look for evidence and information in there for why the numbers in the commitments are going up or down, and a good explanation and justification for those changes every time. So the SCDS Outlook is a public document which will certainly include the commitments, the SCDS commitments, and will be capable of demonstrating the areas of focus for project supply chain ambition and help identify alignment between projects and areas of focus for a capable and expanding supply chain. I must just note the Outlook is a public document. The narrative is expected to include probably significant commercially sensitive information, so is kept by Crown Estate Scotland and government, noting that sensitivity. Objectives, so why on earth are we doing this? So there's the long-term sustainability of the offshore wind market in Scotland is clearly linked to the capability and capacity of the supply chain. Projects are going to be successful where they can be built in a predictable way, in a successful way. And we see that the sort of long-term ambition requiring a supply chain that's going to be able to plan, build and operate projects all over the coast of Scotland, all around the coast of Scotland. The volume and deployment rate of the project pipeline are critical factors to supply chain development, foreseeability of the market and confidence in that market is absolutely essential. And we see ScotWind leasing as being a perfect avenue to sort of help maximise that opportunity and help with that sort of visibility and rate of deployment needed for significant supply chain growth. So we designed the process in a way which will provide transparency and consistency and a clear structure of reporting for project developers to identify where they need a capable supply chain and where they need inputs to successfully build their project. We see the ambition of the sector deal and the current delivery efforts and the CFD requirements as being a sort of important part of the picture. We feel the SCDS process is designed to make that more visible from earlier in the project and allow that sort of transparency to really help everybody see what the real ambition and potential outcomes are. So the introduction of consequences has been discussed, and we feel that brings a lot to the credibility and reliability of the process. So any supply chain commitments or jobs commitments included, we feel will provide reliable indicators for the supply chain of where the potential future market is, which will help with investment, it'll help with capability and skills, and really will allow it to be used by the projects and by the supply chain to achieve the objectives that we'd sort of touched on, if you remember, 15 minutes ago on slide 1. You'll be pleased to know that's the end of those slides. Hopefully I've covered enough detail. Clearly it's tricky on the webinar to see the nodding heads and smiling faces, but I'm sure they're all nodding and smiling, so thank you.
Thank you, Colin, for that. I'm sure there were lots of nods and smiles as you worked your way through these slides. And so what we're going to do now is move on to the Q&A session, and I'm going to hand over to Paul O'Brien to facilitate this next section. Paul is our interim cluster manager for Deepwind. I'm sure is known to many of you, so I'll hand over to Paul now, and he has been keeping an eye on the questions as they've come in.
Gillian, thanks for that. Can I ask the presenters to switch their webcams on? Want to see your faces flinch when we ask some of these questions. Now, we've had quite a response on the questions, and we're going to try and get through as many as we can in the time we've got, but we've got about 15 minutes to do this, slightly less than that. So I'm going to pick and choose between them, and I'm sorry if not everybody's question gets in, but we will send out a list of the questions and the answers so that everyone will get their questions answered. Some of the questions, well, one in particular has asked the panel for something that actually the panel's not involved in, so you will excuse me if I don't go into the one about the fishing industry, which is really aimed at Marine Scotland rather than Crown Estate Scotland. So I'll just mention that now. Now, Brian, your section kicked off quite a number of questions, so we'll start with that. You'd mentioned target of 6,000 jobs, and the question was, do we have a breakdown of where these 6,000 jobs are expected to be, categories? Is there any further information on that?
So from memory, we calculated that was based on there was work done by, I think it was Vivid Economics as part of the sector deal looking at the UK. And we utilised the information from that, and there was some other work undertaken by Scottish Renewables, of which that's how we used to build up the numbers within Scotland. So there probably was some form of breakdown, but for the life I can't remember exactly how that would have been broken, how it was exactly broken down, and then it was built back up again to create the numbers and the goals. 6,000 jobs.
Okay. In relation to the jobs created, the other question again to yourself, Brian, as I say, your one kicked off quite a number of the questions. Are there ambitions related to KPIs for education and the training of the workforce? Knowledge performance indicators.
It's a good one. The KPI part has been discussed, and as also that group has been led by Jim Brown from ESP, and in Jim's. There's been discussion regarding the KPIs. What before we kind of really established those, it was clear we had to get an understanding of what the actual skill demand was, and so Jim's working up a plan just now and how we actually, how we establish that. So he's done some survey work, obviously, and engaged with the clusters in that regard. and really the outcome of that, once it's been modelled, is to basically make sure we understand where the gaps are, what way what the specific breakdowns in relation to where we've looked to recruit and how the attractiveness of these jobs are. Also make sure we do provide in within that for the diversity of the workforce. And I know that Jim is closely engaged with the offshore wind sector deal investment in talent work stream as well, because they're looking at across the UK basis. So no KPIs yet, but certainly there is a plan in place to ensure that we do understand what the needs are. But that's related again back to obviously the scale of the deployment and capacity we're looking to achieve, and the goals, and also the kind of UK content and the ambition around that, which is part of the sector deal as well.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I'm going to jump to Colin. This one is definitely for you. It should be a quickie to answer. The option fee, is it a one-off fee or is it an annual payment over the 10 years?
Yeah, the option fee is payable up front for the whole option period. And that is up to 10 years, but it's until they call the lease, basically. After they've called the lease, then they start to pay rent.
Okay. Now, there was quite a number of questions, as you can imagine, related to local content. So some of them were aimed at you, Brian, but the rest were aimed at Colin. So maybe between the two of you, if I can go to Colin first of all, the general question, there's a number of questions. I'm just going to roll them all into one because they're all about local content, how you're going to enforce it, how is it going to be measured, etc. And basically, is it, when you say local content, do you mean Scotland or the UK? So that's about 5 questions in one, but generally that's what they're asking, all about local content, how you're going to measure it and how you're going to manage it and enforce it. Now, so if you want to have a go at that.
Sure. So firstly, I suppose I'll defer to Brian on the sector deal ambition at a UK level and the numbers that are included in there, and then consequently the SOEC ambition, which is linked to delivery of sector deal ambition in Scotland, and also the Scottish Government's aspirations on growth of the supply chain in Scotland. In terms of the leasing and the supply chain development statement, what we're doing is creating visibility of the intended or the committed jobs within Scotland, within the UK, within Europe. I was going to say the EU, but Europe, not including UK, and the rest of the world. So what we're hoping is that people are the applicants and option holders are going to be clear on where their aspirations are, and that will drive the right kind of conversations for the most capable and competent supply chain to be in a position to make the investments to win the work for the projects that are coming. Okay,
Brian, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Colin just mentioned about the sector deal. So the kind of the targets there, which is also 6% UK content by 2030. Obviously extremely keen for that to be met and exceeded. And I think it's from a SOEC perspective, it's extremely important that Scotland gets as fair, if not more than that, fair share of that. And I bet that ultimately, there's different mechanisms to do that. Supportive of ScotWind and the supply chain development statement, obviously, because it does ensure the developers are focused and considering Scottish content and the supply to the projects. And there is, as a commitment, there needs to be, there could be obviously detrimental impacts as we move through that process associated with the lease as well. But obviously, what we're extremely keen to do is rather have a kind of forced approach to it. I think if we can provide that through an encouraged route, in which we have actually got a supply chain which can compete not only in a Scottish UK context but in a global context, then there is going to be that sustainability, and that's the key to provide longevity to the industry within Scotland.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Can I give this one to Simon? And it's saying here, can foreign investors apply if they cannot demonstrate capability experience for ScotWind leasing, but if they have a track record not in building wind farms, but are experienced in the oil and gas industry?
Absolutely, there is no barrier to being a previous developer. There's many of the people we know that are applying for this don't have experience in offshore wind farms. So certainly anybody who's looking to set up in Scotland and looking to take a lease, we'd warmly speak to, and would also encourage them to speak to us so we could do as much as we could to maximise the opportunity for Scotland.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Gillian, you'd mentioned the engagement process. So someone's asking, how do they engage in that?
Yes, okay. What we're really highlighting just now is the need and the necessity that will be early stage engagement throughout all both the public sector partners, but importantly the businesses, the supply chain and the communities. So what I would say is all our contact details will be available after the event. If there are developers who are looking to make contact with specific companies or communities and you don't have that link already, then please come through the enterprise agencies and we can help direct you to the right point of contact.
Okay. Can I just say in general, there's been a number of questions about the availability of the presentations. Everybody that's registered for this webinar will receive a link to the recording and a link to download a PDF of that as well. So that should answer those questions. Colin, can I come back to you on this one? Is there a timeline chart available for when to submit the SCDS and the CPS, etc.?
Yeah, sorry. So the best timeline we have is until the closure of registrations, which is for potential applicants to register every possible application that they might make. Then it becomes a question of the adoption of the sectoral marine plan. So once the SMP is adopted, there'll be a period of communication where we're then able to be clearer on timelines. So the SCDS, in terms of process, needs to be submitted with the application to us and with the ScotWind application. It's then updated every 2 years throughout the option period until the time when the developer wants to call a lease, so approximately financial close for the project. That's the time when they submit to us the contracted position statement, and the analysis is done to see whether the commitments are present in the contracted position statement, if they align with the final supply chain development statement, and if those conditions are met, then they can take a lease, and if conditions are not met, then there'll be a contractual element which will be implemented by us in accordance with that agreement.
Okay, sorry, sticking with you, there was another what we call technical question related to the application process. Can you register more than one project through the portal, but then only proceed with one full application?
Essentially, yes. You need to register each application that you may make. So if you are thinking at the moment you might register 2 or 3 applications and you're not sure, then you should register 3. And then if you only apply for 2, then that's fine. There's just 1 registration unused. However, if you only register 2, but in the end you want to apply for 3, then that will be a different story.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, this is going to have to be the final question. It's a rather sort of high level one. So whoever wants to answer this one, you can put your hand up. What are your thoughts on a Scottish hydrogen strategy? And I'm assuming this is in relation to offshore wind, of course. And I have to say, it wasn't me that answered this question. Anyone?
I'll pick that one up. Yeah, I mean, obviously hydrogen is an interesting one just now, the technology itself. I think there is obviously huge potential for it. I think, you know, there's another discussion around now is about kind of blue and green hydrogen, obviously from an offshore wind perspective, it's very much encourage green hydrogen. I think it has, in looking at the overall wider energy mix for GB, I think there is a place for it, without a doubt. I think the extent of seabed, sea space that Scotland has, and considering the infrastructure that Scotland has, both from a, you know, in the kind of historical and oil and gas perspective, we're in a very good position to maximise the benefits once that technology does mature and be commercialised. So yeah, I think there is definitely a place. I think there's a place linked in between offshore wind and hydrogen that can support the GBE market. So very much welcome that technology as it develops over time.
Okay, thanks, Brian. So sorry, that's us come to the end of the opportunity for the question and answer session. I'd just like to say that this is the first of our joint cluster webinars, and there will be a number of them over the next few months with specific developer updates and some procurement for webinars from the developers as well. So thanks again. I can just pass over to Gillian now for a summing up.
Yes, thank you very much, Paul. I think you've really done it there. It's just really emphasising the ongoing engagement that we're looking to have with industry, industry-wide, and we look forward to rolling out the series of cluster webinars over the coming months. And thank you all for your attendance.
It just leaves me to conclude the webinar, thank our speakers, but also a huge thanks to our audience and massive thanks for all the engagement. And we look forward to sending out the recording and additional information after the webinar. Thank you for your time and have a good day. Bye-bye now.